Welcome to this new episode. My name is Candice Sanderson. Thank you for tuning in. I am sharing a message from way back in October. The year was 2013, 2 months after my opening to Spirit had begun. You know, I didn't really know where this episode was going until I started looking at my journal to find a message to share today. For those new to my podcast, I started spontaneously channeling messages from the 5D, from spirit, from the other side of the veil, whatever you want to call it. And that happened in late August 2013. When I received messages, especially initially, they came in a dictation format. I hear when and how to end a sentence, when to start a new paragraph. They spell and even pronounce unfamiliar words. And if I make a mistake, I hear strike that, followed by the correct words. I would record these messages on my iPhone in the mornings as I drove to work. And soon afterwards, usually that night, I would transcribe them into a Word document, which obviously became my journal. So as I went through my journal to look for a message for this episode, I discovered patterns that I did not know existed. I'm not too sure what to make of them. So let me share, and you can decide for yourself what they mean, if they mean anything at all. The message I'm going to share is from October 27th, 2013, 2 months after I had begun channeling. And when I read this message, I realized I needed to give more context for everyone to better understand it, including me. Because this was so soon after I had opened, there weren't that many messages before them, 20 to be exact. I went through my journal and I listed when the messages came and what the topic was. And this is where I found the pattern. Let me start, though, with the very first message. It arrived as I drove to work very early one morning to my day job as a psychologist. It was a message about a flower being a flower, so taking that word flower and hyphenating it, a flower of energy. It was poetic, very lyrical in the language as it compared humans to plants. When plants are grounded in Mother Earth, and as they ascend toward Father Sky, they are in perfect alignment with Source. And that's when they produce a flower. The message continued to say that we too, as humans, can blossom into our highest potential. And aside here, a couple of years later, these messengers identified themselves as the muses within. I now recognize them when the language of the message gets very expressive and very lyrical. I know who it is. But as I drove to work when I got this first message, I quickly dismissed it. It's like, oh, this is really interesting. But I never guessed that it was a message from Spirit. Frankly, I didn't know what it was, so I just tried to deny it. I tried to forget it. As soon as I got to work, I had the first mystical experience of my life. It was with a beautiful royal poinciana tree. These trees have blossoms that look like orchids. They're very beautiful, very intricate. But this particular tree, I had passed it 100 times before, but this time something happened. This tree spoke to me, and I understood that it was as alive as I was. Then my attention was called to an unopened bud on the tree, and I realized that bud represented me. It represented us. We are that potential waiting to bloom, to flow, to be that flower, that flower of energy. And that's when I had to do a double take on that flower message from just a few minutes before. I realized these were significant events, but I did not have a clue what would happen next, if anything. Was this a one-time event? I had no idea. So that's the backstory. Now I want to get to the list that I made, and I'll share with you my pattern of channeling. Message number one was the flower message. 2 weeks after that, actually 2 weeks and a day, I had a message from Becky. Becky was a friend of mine, a kindergarten teacher that I knew, and she had passed a few years before. From that point on, I made certain to have my iPhone ready with my recording app opened each morning when I got in my car to go to work. If anything happened, I would record it. I was ready to document it. Since that time, I've come to understand that connecting with the 5D is like water in a garden hose. At first, the hose might be a little crimped, but when the first few dribbles of water come through, it makes room for more. It's going with the flow, just like that flower, that flower of energy. But looking at my outline, I had deceased friends or family of friends come through with messages for their loved ones here on earth. As I said, the first was Becky. 4 days later, Mike came through. 3 days later, Robin. 4 days later, Marilyn's mom, stepmom, and father. 1 day later, Ellen's mother and two aunts. This brings us to September 24th, 2013, just 4 days shy of a month from that first message on August 28th. So there was definitely a progression. Not only were the messages coming more frequently, but these spirits started coming to me in groups. Using that garden hose analogy, the water was definitely flowing. It's interesting, until I prepared for this episode, I had no idea of this pattern, but let me share it. Then I had another break in communication, another wait time. Not 2 weeks and 1 day like the first break, but pretty close. 2 weeks and 2 days this time. This first message after the second break, however, was very different from the mediumship messages. It was a message for a friend I know who was researching her family tree. This message was instructive, like a class lecture. I had no idea who was sharing this information. It wasn't like the other mediumship messages where a spirit or a group of spirits were telling me who they were and asking me to give a message to their family back on earth. This was an unknown source that was actually teaching a lesson. It was educational, specifically showing me how the brain operates as a radio tuner. I didn't realize it at the time, but this message was preparing me for what would become a shift in my perspective. It was getting me to open my eyes to life and helping me realize that there really is more to life than just what the physical senses measure. It was the first message on perceiving life differently. I was learning that the brain does not think, but instead it tunes into energy frequencies. 2 days later, I did a soul retrieval on a young man who had passed away over 20 years before. He was stuck and hadn't quite made it completely to the other side. I helped escort him farther into the 5D. So this wasn't mediumship, although I spoke with him, but it was what I later found out the shamans call psychopomp work, helping guide his spirit on his final journey. He had been lost during those 20 plus years since he had passed, but now he was ready to approach that light on the other side that many of us have read about or heard about. 3 days later, I had more messages, this time 2 messages in one day. One was from my mother who had passed away many years before, and the other was also from a family member. But they weren't contacting me with the mediumship communications. Instead, they told me things that occurred in their lives and why. My mother, for example, talked about different exit points in her life, different times that she could choose to transition. She then described in detail something that occurred in my childhood that would have ended much differently than it did. In fact, she showed me that ending. She showed me how this was one of the exit points for her, but she chose not to take it. I knew nothing about planning your life before you arrive on Earth. I didn't even know there was a before Earth life. So I certainly did not know anything about planning exit points when you transition from Earth. So these messages were very different from anything I had received. They were giving me snippets of a life that was much more expansive than I knew about. I definitely had a lot to learn. But looking at the pattern in the list of my first 2 months of channeling, and I guess all I can say is that the energy flow was becoming very strong, and those channels were definitely opening wide. 2 days after that, the focus of the messages shifted again, and I heard from a star system, Chiron and Alpha Centauri, actually 2 star systems, I guess. I learned how these star systems were creating changes in their sister star, our sun, and I learned how these changes affected Earth. The next day, I learned of techniques on how to heal. The following day, I learned about fairies. Then, multiple messages started coming in daily. The topics changed frequently. I learned about something called the energy recognition system. In retrospect, all these new topics were setting me up for a paradigm shift on how to view the world. I learned about the purpose of meditation, and then I learned the truth behind the butterfly effect. The next day, a mediumship message came through. It was from a friend of mine, her father came through. So this brings us to October 26th, 2013, 2 days shy of 2 months from my initial channeling. After now seeing the pattern of messages that had brought me to this point, I can understand better this next message that arrived the next day. So here we go. October 27th, 2013. Let me read the message. She is curious whether this group of energy will stay with her or whether she will be the receptor of other energy entities. As she learns to transverse the different energy patterns, different groups will gather her attention. Just as she is aware of the different energies amongst our group by way of voice, intonation, and inflection, she will become aware of different groups or clusters of energies, such as ours. This was a great overview of what was actually occurring. I've learned since then that many who are connected to the 5D have had these connections all their lives, or some seem to have gotten these skills through some sort of event, like a near-death experience or a Kundalini event. I'm still not real sure what that is, though. But this, it was new to me. I was treading in new territory. But let me unpack this first paragraph. That first sentence, talks about me being curious, which I was, about whether this quote group of energy will stay with me or whether I will be the quote receptor of other energy entities. When they use phrases like groups of energy and receptors and an energy entity to be the receptor, that brought back memories of a message about the brain being a radio tuner, a receptor for those subtle energies of spirit. And those terms like groups of energy or energy entities, what they do is they actually reframe these extraordinary events in terms of energy. And when they do that, this language demystifies the mystical. What is mystical anyway? It's something that we cannot explain, so it seems magical. But not so with this message. Using terms related to energy, not spirit, it's not magical. It is not mystical. It's not mysterious at all. Let's go to the second paragraph. On one level, she is already aware of this, for there are times when she receives messages of mediumship and other times messages from us, from the stars. She has also received messages from what humans call their higher self. There's a lot to unpack from those two sentences. Receiving messages from us, the stars, the cosmos, I had messages from Alpha Centauri and Chiron. Was it from them? I'm not real sure. But when they talk about the messages from my higher self, I wasn't sure what the higher self was. But by process of elimination, I looked at that list of 20 messages I had received so far. This message was number 21. Were those messages about energy and healing from my higher self? Maybe. I wasn't too sure at the time. So let's go to the next paragraph because I actually do get some clarification. Messages from the higher self are geared towards the specific soul that she has and the soul's purpose in the earth plane. Certain patterns of learning and why that occurs is discussed for learning purposes. Once again, as I attempt to unpack this paragraph, more information surfaces. That first sentence is talking about messages from the higher self are specifically geared toward the specific soul that I have and the soul's purpose on the earth plane. Didn't really know what that meant, but it does tell me a lot. At this stage of my spiritual opening, only 2 months in length, I was a pragmatist. You live your life through the 5 senses. When you die, my religious upbringing had taught me that if you were good, whatever that means, you just might go to heaven. But the scientist part of me, my training as a psychologist, suggested it might just be biology. You die, your body decays. End of story. So, as far as having a higher self or a specific soul as part of this higher self, this was a new concept. I thought, what? It brought more questions. If it were possible that I was part of this higher self, were there other parts, other souls of this higher self also living, like at this time? Parallel lives? I had never heard of such a thing. Could it also mean reincarnation? These days, I certainly believe in reincarnation. It just makes sense that part of us, our soul, our spirit, returns to earth in different circumstances, including different stations in life, genders, cultures, in order to learn. Then we rejoin our greater self, our higher self, when that life is over. Rinse and repeat, returning to Earth or maybe to other places to work on either new lessons or maybe on the same lesson if we haven't yet mastered it. But back when this message arrived, these concepts were new. It was like the information about the brain being a radio receiver and that I was connecting with energy entities. The messengers were laying a foundation for a new set of beliefs that over time I eventually accepted. I know now that many psychics have always known about these things. They have always had a connection. They've always had a certain skill set or a gift, but not me. I did not come into this world with this knowledge or with any kind of special skill or a gift. I started on page 1 with the messengers hand feeding me this information bit by bit. They basically say this in the second sentence when they say these things are discussed for learning purposes. This was to teach me, to inform me of a new way of life. At the time, I did not know what the outcome might be, but I was willing to be that objective observer and just see where this would take me. It was easy enough for me to do this. After all, that's what my training as a psychologist had taught me. Sit back and document. Don't judge. And as the messenger said, let the energy flow. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Our cluster, Chiron, will always be with her, and she will always be able to tap into our energy fields. As she gains more experience, her receptors will become more sensitive, and she will be able to determine the source from which the messages came. She is noticing now that the voice and the cadence of this one speaking to her are different from the voice that she calls authoritative. In my journal, I had noted that these new messengers had a more authoritative voice. But what's interesting to me is that the messenger self-identifies as Chiron, a star system I had met just a few days before. Sounds like this connection to the messengers is here to stay and that they will always be with me. Overall, I was in new territory with my relationship with these 5D messengers. However, each day I woke up with this sense of wonder and excitement to see what would happen with my newfound friends. Let's go to the last paragraph of the message. She will be able to knowingly tap into energy fields of awareness as the need arises. As she continues her path of receiving energy messages, her receptivity will become clearer, and she will be able to ascertain even more specific and more subtle energy fields. This comes from the previously discussed energy path that is laid down and then established as connections continue. These connections will always be with her from this point on. Previously discussed energy path that is established. What they're referencing are those star beings I'd met just a few days before, and this is who is giving me the message, Chiron. But in that initial contact with the star beings, they referenced an energy path. They said they were creating an arc of energy to aid their sister star, our sun. This arc provides an energy path for Earth to follow as she begins transforming to a higher frequency. In this first message about pathways, these star beings then spoke of how similar this was to neural pathways in the brain, so they were bringing it down to a very specific level. Pathways to the 5D was new. It was a new concept for me, but I could certainly understand neural pathways. If someone has a stroke, the brain will work around that injured area to rewire itself. The first time we use this new neural pathway, it does not function very well. It's clunky, it's awkward, but the more we use it, the better it becomes, the more efficient it becomes. It's apparently the same with these energy paths to the 5D that the messengers speak of. They end the message by saying, "These connections will always be with me." So there it is. There's no going back to the way life used to be. Not that I wanted to do so anyway. I don't know how most people bridge that gap between the 3D and the 5D. I'm not too sure how I did, other than it just seemed to happen to me. But one question I had asked 2 months before was finally answered. It was that question I had on that first early morning commute when I received that message about the flower. Was this a one-time event, or would it continue? The messengers answered that question. They were always with me. It would continue. But the rest is up to me. Will I call on these messengers to assist me when I need them? Rarely have I done that, actually call on them. But knowing that they have my back is priceless. I like it when they show up without me specifically asking. And when that happens, I know the messages they share are significant and something I really need to pay attention to. But instead of calling on them, I will now allow myself a quiet space to listen. Stepping into stillness will allow that wisdom to come forth. Stepping into silence allows that divine flow of energy from that 5D to wash through my energy body. And when it does, those stale energies leave, they dissipate, they wash away. Any blockages I have are flushed out of my system. I become a cleaner, sharper channel, allowing for wisdom at my fingertips. I listen to my heart. I know it will never lead me astray. My path to spirit is specific just to me, but I share this story with you to let you know that if you are open and if you follow the path of your heart, you too might find yourself being guided toward your higher self. And on that note, I'm reminded what Bob Monroe from Monroe Institute used to always say: you are more than your physical body. This is a good stopping point. Remember to listen to the wisdom of your heart. It's that heart energy that is a portal. It connects us to our higher selves, to our guides, to our angels. It starts that flow that will wash away the cobwebs and allow for a fresh look at any challenges we perceive. We just might begin to see these so-called challenges in a different light. What is the life lesson here? Why are we in this situation? What do we need to learn? When we perceive from a greater perspective, we often identify the lesson and we learn it. Then we can check that box off our list and move on to the next lesson. Thank you for letting me into your homes. Remember how important kindness is. Always use kind words. I welcome you to follow, like, comment, and subscribe. So until next time, my friends, goodbye.